Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and I've got this fan over here operating to bring air over the bins in my wormery because recently I've been experiencing a lot of moisture in my bins, and I have actually found over the past 5 or 6 days that the movement of the air over the bins is really helping to dry out at least the material on the surface. And then once in a while I go in there and I'll stir the material around, bring the more damp stuff to the surface, sink down the drier stuff that's had a chance to air out, and it's really helping to equalize the moisture in my bins. And I just thought really quick I would explain why this is here. The bin that we're going to work on today is my oldest bin. It's 175 days old as of today, which equates to 25 weeks. So one more week and it's half a year old. And for the past, how long has it been? 45 days now. So that's about a month and a half almost now. The past month and a half we've been trying to get the worms to exit the finished compost so that at some point soon we could try to harvest the material out of the container. So I've got that bin right here on the top shelf, and it is and it's got no covers on it with the exception of what's covering the feeding zone area. The feeding zone is just here on the very edge, attempting to become the place where we try to lure the worms into. And as this material gradually gets depleted of food and also gets depleted of moisture as it evaporates, it should become less and less hospitable for the worms, hopefully spurring on their migration over into the side to help us more easily remove them from the bin. And it's been 2 weeks now since we last removed worms from this bin. We did check in here a week ago just to make sure that the feeding zone is sufficiently stocked with food. Just in case they've depleted what was in there, we made sure that there was more food in there, but we didn't remove any worms. And the main reason for that at that point was that I really had nowhere to put the worms. But more recently I did start a new bin, and that new bin is right here on the floor. And now I've got a place to put worms if I decide that I want to try to pull some out of that bin and relocate them. So my first objective in that bin is to examine the material, stir it up to help it dry, and try to figure out if it still requires additional time to help the worms move out, or do we already have a tub full of depopulated castings. So I'm going to get that tub up onto the bench so we can get to work on it. Alright, so before we get into the feeding zone to see how the worm population has congregated in here, let's take a quick look through the material to see how it looks. The stuff on the very top surface is drying out. The one thing for sure is that when castings begin to dry out, they become very, very hard. They're almost rock hard. So that's really nothing to be concerned about. Once we stir it up, this dry stuff will get rehydrated once it's mixed with more damp material that's down below, and it'll soften up again, so that's not a problem. But let's start examining this material to see how it looks. So I mean, right off the bat, we've already got a number of worms within view, right here within this first handful. And the material is pretty damp still too. So I think it'll definitely benefit from a little bit of stirring around by moving the more dry material on the surface down into the wet stuff. They'll kind of share the moisture so that the more damp stuff will dry out as a result slightly, and the dry stuff will rehydrate, softening it up. So here on the very edge is where we probably would expect to see the greatest number of worms, possibly working their way over into our feeding zone, sensing that there's food over there, or at least there was food over there. I'm not sure what to expect, whether or not the food supply in there still remains or if it's been depleted yet, but we'll get over into checking that out momentarily. First thing I really want to take care of is getting this material stirred up a little bit and mixed together, and at the same time it gives us a chance to examine how it's coming along. Quite a bit more damp than I would want it to be. So I think that by mixing it together with the dry stuff that's on the surface, it should help a little bit. And just the mere agitation of the material to create little air pockets throughout it should also help a little bit. So I do like the idea also of taking larger clumps of material and helping it break up so that there's little air pockets in between everywhere. Not only does that kind of air the material out, but I also believe that it aids in the mobility of the worms through the material, so that they could probably move through the castings a little bit more easily if they're inspired to do so. Hopefully they're able to sense the food on the other end of the bin, and by not being obstructed by overly damp and dense castings, they can try to make their way over there a little bit more easily. I believe one of the main things that contributed to the material getting so damp was sort of a delayed reaction on my part, because for the longest time we were covering the bin up with plastic, and the purpose of that plastic was to not let moisture in the bin escape and evaporate. But once the humidity started rolling in, since it's summertime now, that was no longer really a concern, and it was probably at that point that I should have already removed the plastic to allow for a little bit better airflow in and out of the bin. And I guess other things that could have been done were perhaps feeding less damp foods, possibly using greater amounts of bedding to help sop up any excess moisture. So one of the big things in vermicomposting is to try to learn from your past experiences. You know, I wouldn't want to label those past experiences as mistakes, because there is a pretty large amount of variability in the types of foods you might be feeding, the types of bedding you might be using, the type of bin you're in, the type of worms you have, the type of weather you're experiencing, the type of climate control, where the worms are being stored. So there's a lot of moving parts, and you know, it's very easy to have one of those moving parts sort of work against you in such a way that it happens unknown to you. So you don't want to look back on missed opportunities or foul ups as things to regret. You want to look at those as learning opportunities. And when you do, then you really start to benefit from it, because then you know that you're going to attempt to improve the next go around, and you'll also feel like you've learned as part of the process. And that's just true in everything in life, so it's not just specific to vermicomposting. But I think the one thing that's for sure, as we've been moving our way through this material to check it all out, is that we've got not only a good hardy population of adult worms in here, but almost everywhere you look there's an abundance of really, really small worms too. Almost an equal number of large and small worms, which to me is a sign of breeding occurring in the bin. So the population is multiplying, which is always a good sign too. We'll try to level things off here to a certain degree. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then we could proceed to checking out how our migration attempt has fared. I would think that after a couple weeks since the last time we emptied the feeding zone, I would have to imagine that we've probably managed to accumulate a good number of worms over in that feeding zone. So it does seem like it would be a good time to extract worms and get them moved over into their new home. So let's proceed with examining how our feeding zone is looking. Trying to think of how we can do this best. So I'm going to try to nudge it over here a little bit. And since we'll definitely need to rebuild this feeding zone to continue the ongoing depopulation of the bin, I think we're going to see what we can do about preserving some of this uneaten material here that's on the top surface. So we'll just rest this over here on the side. And it's already nicely broken down, but it's still perfectly usable as fresh bedding in our rebuilt feeding zone. And I believe that it's right about here. It's not a very large feeding zone that we had created, so I'm just going to move only that part of it back up against the wall of the bin, and then we'll just treat that as the stuff that we're going to relocate. And you know, it is true that along with whatever worms there are in there, we are also relocating a fair bit of finished castings too. So, you know, maybe if I find a fairly good sized chunk of castings like this that doesn't have a great number of worms or no worms in it, maybe I can just keep that over here with the rest of the finished compost in the bin. But I believe that for the most part we're going to be relocating the majority of these finished castings over here in the feeding zone with the worms. And I've got a plastic container here that we could put our collected worms into. So why don't I rest that right over here alongside our salvaged bedding that we're going to recycle. And then we'll start loading everything that's come together over here in this feeding zone into this plastic container. We'll try to do it this way. We'll flip it over so we could see what kind of a worm population has congregated in here. Since I'm assuming that the most damp material is on the bottom, and that's where we're going to expect to find the worms, I'm simply flipping the whole thing over as I bring it over. And they've definitely done a good job depleting the food that was placed in here for them. So we think we got in here just in the nick of time. Last week when we were in here, a week ago, we didn't remove worms, but we did try to boost up the food supply in here. So we added food, but I'm seeing very little signs of it left in here. Sometimes it's hard to tell what you're looking at. This almost looks to me like a piece of banana peel. It had a couple worms on it that I've knocked off, so I'd like to move them and migrate them. But as far as being useful in our feeding zone, it makes sense to keep it around rather than move it with the worms. And if I find any other large chunks of bedding in here that's free of worms, I guess we can keep that here too. After all, we're just looking to migrate worms here. We're not necessarily looking to bring a whole bunch of food over with them. The new bin that I'm putting them into actually was launched yesterday. It was built prior, a day or two ago, and the population of that new bin at this time, I believe, is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,000 worms. So the other reason I like to try to skim out stuff from here that's not worms is to give us a better view of how many worms we're moving over. So I don't want to go crazy trying to figure out how many worms we're relocating, but it would be nice to get a rough idea. So I've been doing my best to give myself at least a rough estimate of how many worms I'm migrating each time I do so that once that bin is done being populated over the course of a number of different worm relocations, I come up with some sort of a rough estimate of how many worms there might be in there. So here too we've got an item that I would definitely consider as a slow composting food item. It's a mango pit. The worms are doing a pretty nice job consuming. You can see a whole bunch of worms stuffed right inside of it too. So as much as I would like to get these worms to stay here in this clear plastic tray so that I can move them to their new home, I do think I would prefer to keep this food item in our feeding zone, since it does seem to do a good job attracting the worms and keeping their interest. I'm also sensing another couple large food items here. This is the stem of some sort of a vegetable. Once again, pretty popular item with a whole bunch of worms cruising around on it. So I'd like to move the worms, but not the food. We'll keep that here with the stuff that we're going to keep in the feeding zone. And then here too we've got some salvageable cardboard type materials. All good stuff that should probably go back into our feeding zone as part of the bedding when we rebuild it. Here we've got, popular item, another piece of banana peel. As you saw, it had a good number of worms hanging out on it. So there too, probably a good item to keep in our feeding zone when we rebuild it. So I'll see about evicting worms from it and then keeping it over here with the stuff that we're going to rebuild with. It's hard to get a good view of the worms all as one jumble because they're all so mixed in with the material that they're occupying. But I am getting the sense that we've probably got, something in the neighborhood of maybe 600 or 700 worms here, and we've not yet extracted all of them either. We've still got another handful of material here. So if my estimate is true, and if we've got 2/3 of the material and this is the last third of it, then we've probably got something in the neighborhood of 1,000 worms getting relocated here. Here too we've got a good number of worms hanging out. Definitely a lot of worms in here, so I would definitely say that we're probably somewhere in the 1,000 range in terms of how many worms we've successfully rounded up here for migration. And I consider that to be a success, so I'm happy to see that. And another thing that we're going to pull out of here and keep with the recycled bedding and food items that we're going to recycle is this eggshell. Because within the eggshell we had placed a little jumble of human hair, and that's my hair that was in here. So I'm always curious to see how it's progressing because I did receive some comments about it. People had made mention of how long hair might take to actually get broken down by the worms, and they said it could take many, many months. So I'm certainly not expecting to see a huge amount of progress on that every time I check in on it. And as a matter of fact, I had almost decided to abandon checking in on it, but I guess I had a little bit of a change of heart, and I figured why not keep looking in on it if possible, as long as it's here. And that's the reason I placed it into that eggshell, just to make it easier to locate next time we come through here. So we'll include that in the rebuilt feeding zone, in the rebuilt horizontal migration feeding zone. And that'll just give us another opportunity at some point in the future to check in on it and see how it's progressing. But like I said, it's probably not the sort of thing you would expect to see huge progress on anytime soon, if what I was told is true in the comments. So I think we've done a pretty good job trying to exclude any of the items in here that are still perfectly usable in our feeding zone that we're going to be rebuilding momentarily. But we don't need to go nuts doing so. Bringing some of this stuff over with the worms is perfectly fine. So why don't we just go ahead and set this pile of worms aside, and we'll get back to them momentarily once we bring their new home up here onto the bench and release them into their new quarters. But before we can consider ourselves finished over here in this container, we would want to reset this feeding zone here so that this migration of the worms could continue. I'm going to begin by placing some fresh bedding down into the bottom of this feeding zone here. I like the idea of using cardboard And leaves are also a great material to use as bedding. So now you saw what a great job they did gobbling up all the food that they received a week ago. And offhand, I can't remember if it was a lot of food they received or not that much. But I think I'm going to go pretty generous on reloading this feeding zone this time. So I've got a whole bunch of stuff here. It's pretty much a mixture of old celery, old broccoli, stuff that sort of got lost in the crisper of the refrigerator. It's at this point well gone beyond the point where it could be eaten by humans, but it's pretty much perfect for our worms. So I'm going to drop all that in here, and you can see it's a huge mound of food. So I'm going to attempt to spread it out sort of evenly here. And the little deviation that I've done here from what I typically do is that I typically throw the food that the worms are going to receive into the freezer for a while, at least long enough so that it freezes, since the freezing and thawing of food does sort of help soften it up a little bit, make it a little bit more accessible by the worms for eating. But this stuff just came out of the refrigerator this morning. Just a little bit of a cleanup effort in the refrigerator. And this stuff just hasn't had a chance to be placed into the freezer to get that prep. But I think it should be fine. I'm sure the worms will enjoy it just the same. So now we've got some reclaimed stuff here that we were going to recycle back into the feeding zone. But you know, before we start piling the old stuff on, let's add to this a little bit of crushed eggshell, which is my source of grit for my composting worms. And before we start piling on some of this old stuff, let's make sure we first pull out these larger feeding items, such as this mango seed. Get that back in here. And we can also restore this experimental item, which is the eggshell full of my human hair. Let's also use a little bit of my used coffee to cover up with too. So we've definitely got ourselves a really generously stocked feeding zone here. And you saw the number of worms we've got in here, so we know we've got a lot of mouths to feed, so I'm not worried about it not getting eaten. I'm fairly certain that it will get eaten. And my hope is that it'll get eaten soon, so that we can start to see fewer worms in the finished compost and more of them over here in the feeding zone, so that we can get them relocated to their new home and so that we can harvest their castings. Okay, so these two pieces of paper had been used previously to cover up the feeding zone, and we'll reuse them again in the same way. But before we cover up, I want to try to backfill this material here so we've got a good surface area up against the feeding zone so that the worms have a good easy way to access the food in the feeding zone. So I want to make sure that it's piled up nice and high to the same level of the feeding zone. And I guess by moving some of the material up like that on this side, that also gives us the opportunity to sort of thin out the material on this side so that hopefully it has a better chance of drying out. It's pretty cool. So let's get this baby covered back up. Let these little guys get back to work. We definitely want to, you know, encourage the evaporation of the material over here, but over here, maintaining a higher moisture level is a good thing because that's what the worms like. And as long as we've got good moisture over in the feeding zone, we have a better likelihood of seeing the worms move over into it. Okay, so that's where we stand today with our 25-week-old, 175-day-old worm bin. Maybe we'll check in another week to see how the feeding zone's coming along, how the material's drying out. But before we proceed, let's not forget about the worms that we extracted. We've still got to get them situated in their new home. So let me get the new bin out here so we can release the worms that we've collected. So what I've got going on here is just a piece of cardboard, but it's wrapped in plastic. And for the most part, I've been removing the plastic coverings from most of my bins, but in a brand new bin like this one, I believe that there is a benefit to promoting the recirculation of moisture that would otherwise evaporate. So here we go. All I'm going to do is invert this container and drop them in. Maybe spread the contents around a little bit to make it a little bit easier for the worms to gain access to the material below, and they could more readily retreat. But it will also give us a better view of how many worms we've managed to gather here. So I think we've got ourselves a pretty good haul. Like I said, I'm estimating 1,000, but I'd be curious to see what other people think. So if you think that you've got a rough idea of how many worms we've got in here, then please put it in the comments. Let me know. I'd love to hear. So I'm going to give these guys a minute or two to get down into the material, and then we'll cover up and call it a day. Well, it couldn't have been more than a minute or two since we released these guys, but looks like the majority of them have made their way down into the bin at this point. A couple of them are still out here on the surface, but I'm sure they'll retreat soon too. So hopefully they'll enjoy their new accommodations. So at this point we're up to maybe 2,000 worms in this bin, and I've got other worm bins that I'm going to be using to populate this even further going forward. So I think before I cover up, I'm going to just put a little light sprinkling of leafy matter across the top here. It's mainly because when I put this back on, I don't want to have it sticking. So I want this to come off pretty easily next time I come back in here. But there's really not much left for me to do here. I've just got a few things to put away and clean up, but I won't bore you with that. I'm going to take this as a chance to say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate your company. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to give me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. Also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, take care. Have a great day. Bye now.